Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. A great deal to discuss today. The top of that list for me is that I think we have Vladimir Putin and his intentions entirely wrong. And I'll get into my analysis as to why I think that. Of course, the headline is that the Russian government has recognized the breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine of Luhansk and Donetsk. These are large Russian-speaking majorities within Ukraine. Their separatist leaders appealed to Russia yesterday to be recognized as independent sovereign states, no doubt at the direct instruction of their Kremlin masters. This is the declaration of war. Putin put on a show of consulting his inner circle. Despite the charade, that was interesting to watch. Some were effusive in their praise of this initiative, that the Russian government has a responsibility to protect the Russian speakers abroad, whereas some seemed absolutely petrified. And yet what they were saying did all ultimately fall in line behind Vladimir Putin. He said that he would reserve his decision, which he did for a few hours, and then gave an hour-long speech on what Russia needed to do. It's Putin's views of Ukraine, Putin's views of the Soviet Union, his historical grievances, and yes, of course, that Russia would recognize these breakaway regions. Why is this the declaration of war? Well, if you recognize a territory as a sovereign state, then you also recognize that there is a government that is independent of the state which it was formerly a part. And so the breakaway leaders suddenly become presidents of Donetsk or presidents of Luhansk, and they can appeal to the Russian government for support. Say, look, we're worried about instability, we're worried about threats from Ukraine, and that gives Russia the casus belli to send in the troops. So Russia has announced that it is sending in its armed forces to protect the new region of Donetsk and Luhansk, the new territories. And this means that if Ukraine defends itself from this open invasion, which is what it is, then Russia can say the Ukrainian government attacked its peacekeepers, and therefore the Ukrainians are the aggressors, and we will therefore declare war. Make no mistake, what we're seeing here is a textbook way to manufacture a serious interstate conflict. So let's say in your own country, one of the cities didn't want to be part of the country anymore, appealed to a foreign government, say, we want to be recognized as an independent state. That foreign government says, yes, we will recognize you, and sends troops to your new independent state to protect that independent state as peacekeepers. The rest of the country, of course, is outraged that a foreign invader has come and essentially taken territory. That will then respond against the invading military, starting the war. That's exactly what Russia is doing here. It also has some political advantages because in the West, there isn't quite consensus on what to do regarding sanctions. I've heard the appalling suggestion that since Russian forces have been in eastern Ukraine since 2014, the fact that thousands of troops and tanks and artillery pieces are moving across the border into a new breakaway region essentially to absorb it, that's not an invasion because Russian troops had been there since 2014. This wasn't an expansion of the war from that point of view, i.e. The sanctions package was based on the idea that there wouldn't be further Russian invasion of Ukraine, i.e. invasion beyond where Russians already were, and that the recognition of these breakaway regions, while a complete violation of the Minsk agreement does take diplomacy off the table, is not actually Russia expanding the war into territories that have not been in conflict until this date. Now, this is an outrageous and delusive way of looking at it. Russia is declaring war and invading Ukraine as we speak with its vast military that it had amassed along the Ukrainian border over the period of several months. The idea that sanctions should not be imposed at the most expansive possible level is a naked act of cowardice. And I hope that the American response at least will be very severe and that the rest of Europe will start to toe the line, because I've heard rumblings that this isn't really an expansion because Russian forces were already there. That is patently absurd. As I just said, this is the manufacture of an open interstate conflict. Now, this brings me back to Vladimir Putin himself and why I think we have gotten him all wrong. Until now, we have been discussing NATO and buffer states, i.e. that Russia is aggrieved that NATO expanded right to the Russian border. Russia has grave fears that Ukraine could eventually join NATO in the future, that Russia will go to war to prevent that from happening, so as that there is a buffered territory between Russia and NATO, allowing Russia to minimize its military presence on the southwestern periphery and preserve Russian territorial integrity and threat perception. This was the view of the West, this kind of rationalistic view that there was an armed military alliance that was created to be resistant of the Soviet Union expansion, something that Russia feels is deeply threatening. Of course, the northeast of Europe is a territory through which 3 major Russian invasions did take place, one from Sweden, one from Napoleon, and one from the Nazi war machine. All of this seemed, from a rational point of view, even if you vehemently disagreed with it, which I certainly did, you could look at it and say, you could understand a normal person seeing things from the Russian point of view in those circumstances. But watching the speech by Vladimir Putin, the revealed intentions have become clear. And we will look back on this speech 10, 20 years from now, and no one can say they weren't warned. Vladimir Putin laid out a very specific and yet cogent, don't let people say it was a rant, this is a cogent argument that Ukraine is not a real country, that it was carved off as a separate territory for administrative purposes as part of the Soviet Union, and historically its ties are Russian. And so Vladimir Putin's intention is to absorb all of Ukraine into a restored Russian Federation. So the 30,000 troops that are currently in Belarus, they are never leaving. Belarus itself, after Lukashenko, I am certain, will be annexed in its entirety and absorbed into Russia. So you will have Belarus as part of Russia. The next step is for Vladimir Putin to invade and take over all of Ukraine. So how is all this going to play out? Well, of course, Ukraine has to defend itself. It's got peacekeepers invading from the eastern side of Ukraine. Ukraine will have to resist that militarily. That will give Russia the excuse to say that Ukrainian government is acting aggressively against its so-called peacekeepers, which is actually the invading force, giving Russia the casus belli to invade full scale with the ultimate goal of catching Kiev. Now, even if Russia is unsuccessful in securing all of Ukraine, i.e. Places like Lviv in the west being beyond the reach of Russian military forces, well, the goal is not just regime change in Kiev. That was what I thought would happen, is that Russia would invade Kiev, if successful, kick out the Zelensky government and replace it with a government that is pro-Russia, but keep Ukraine as a separate political entity. That is no longer likely. What will happen is Russia will invade Ukraine, take it over and absorb it in its entirety as part of Russia. That will be Vladimir Putin's goal. In part because the breakaway regions in the east, because they're such strong Russian-speaking majorities, without them as part of Ukraine, Ukraine's politics will remain staunchly nationalist, particularly if you carve off the pro-Russian areas. The areas that remain are therefore nationalist. So Vladimir Putin can't afford that. He will invade Ukraine and take it over in its entirety as part of Russia. Kiev being a major historical cultural center for the Rus, Vladimir Putin sees that as part of Greater Russia and therefore will take it over in its entirety. Belarus has already been annexed. This is right out of the playbook of the Soviet Union. You think of Lithuania in 1920. There was a demand that Lithuania host 20,000 Soviet soldiers. Lithuania was forced to acquiesce to that demand. Once Russia came in, they just took over the territory and said, no, now you're part of Russia. Same thing will happen with Belarus. And this will be to prevent any kind of future opposition figure, some Svetlana Tikhanovskaya or someone else, coming in after Lukashenko and starting a color revolution. What will happen? Lukashenko will be transitioned out and Belarus will become part of the Russian Empire. So Vladimir Putin's vision is the complete restoration of the Russian Empire as it was in the period of Catherine the Great. And so the limits of that ambition are all of Ukraine, all of Belarus, all of the Baltic states, linking up all the territory from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad. And any fair reading of his speech shows this to be his clear intention. He doesn't recognize Ukraine as an independent sovereign state. Belarus has already been annexed. NATO, he says, has been expanded way beyond its remit. And the Baltic states can't exist as independent sovereign countries because from Vladimir Putin's perspective, that territory is too much of a strategic threat to Russia because of the invasions that historically have taken place through that region. So a quick recap, Russia has acknowledged the breakaway regions of Ukraine, sent in troops to protect that territory, inviting Ukraine to defend itself, and then will use that as a casus belli for full-scale invasion with the ultimate goal of absorbing most of Ukrainian territory into Russia, whereas Belarus will be annexed after Lukashenko is transitioned out, and then the next step will be NATO. We have all been warned. There is no excuse. The sanctions have to be imposed now. The massive buildup of troops, NATO troops in Eastern Europe is necessary, in the Baltic countries, permanent military presence of the United States and the UK, hopefully Germany and France as well, if they can get their act together. And this is the time to push back against Vladimir Putin because he is making his moves right now and his intentions are clear. Thank you so much. Leave your thoughts down below, hit the like button, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.